for the final session of day 2 of the Future of the American Child Journalism Training, Charlotte. We have come full circle yet again in that we spent the past few days talking about barriers, the challenges for children and families in the path to economic stability. So we identified so many of them. Our next session is going to zero in on something that, while somewhat controversial in some circles, has been pretty much proven to be a solution in that regard. It really does provide families and children with tangible means of moving up out of poverty and moving beyond. We're joined today by Karen Chatfield. She is the director of the Family Economic Security Program at the National Center for Children in Poverty. Karen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Rachel. I appreciate it so much.
I won't even begin to pretend to be on the level of policy expertise that you are on. But what I will share with the fellows is that during our initial conversation about possibly doing this program, I was enlightened so much. It was as if literal flashbulbs were going off in my brain in terms of all of the things I thought I knew about the child tax credit and what I now, in that moment, understood. And I think it's very important for journalists who are covering the world post-COVID, covering socioeconomic issues post-COVID, to really get a solid grasp on this issue. And so we're grateful for you being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Rachel, and again, for this opportunity. I am very happy to be here and happy that I'm allowed to participate on Zoom. If my voice gives out a little bit, today, I'll just take a second to clear it and continue. But I am sad not to be there in the room with you. I was hoping to meet you and learn from you, as well as the other presenters in your sessions. But I hope we'll have an opportunity for a more interactive connection during the Q&A after my presentation. So I'll share my screen now. And as Rachel said, there is great promise and potential in the child tax credit, particularly since the expansion, which started in 2021 and ended at the end of 2021. And I hope to talk a lot about that, as well as about some state child tax credits that also hold promise. And I really do look forward, and I urge you to reach out to me after today if you have more questions. I'm going to go through some slides pretty quickly here that I think will, give you probably more information than you need initially, but you may want to come back to me for some more information later on, and I hope you do. I also just want to give you a sampling here of some areas of focus at the center, and we have a whole other division other than family economic security that works on some pretty important initiatives for children. And our focus tends to be on children in deep poverty, families, family stress, and the mental health of adults and children. So whether you see it here or on our website, or you don't see it but think it's connected to our focus, we would love to hear from you to help you out with any project you're working on in future. So I'll start with just a brief introduction. We all know that the pandemic was an historic event, and right from the start, those who could least afford it were hit more quickly and harder. This slide reflects some research done by the Pew Research Center, I believe in 2022, on what went on in 2020. And what's missing from this slide is that overall, all adults, about 15%, experienced at least one spell of unemployment in 2020. But as this slide does point out, this was higher for low-income adults and not so high for upper-income adults. You see that 7.8%, very different, really, roughly half of what it was for all. But then we have this much higher rate for the low-income adults. And of course, some of those low-income adults, a great many of them were parents. So researchers like to look at the impacts of these events as well as programs and policies as they affect certain groups by income, by race, by family structure, because they both reveal structural inequities and point to solutions. So the next lens here is really looking more at families than at all adults and looking at racial inequity. And what we see here is that, no, let's see here. I seem to have, no, I've not skipped something. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we see here that what we have is a difference by poverty level, by the relationship to the poverty line, by family income, and by race, in terms of those families who experience disproportionate levels of material hardship right away in March and April of 2020. So many families cut their spending on food in those early months, about a third of families, but that proportion is much higher for those families that were living under 2.5 times the federal poverty level, or 250%. And as a descriptor for that, in 2020, that 250% meant that you earned about $54,000 if you were a family of 3. So those families were, 41.4 of those percent of those families reported having that change in their food expenditures almost immediately. And then we see higher levels as well for non-Hispanic Blacks and Hispanic families, parents as well. And then we also like to look at single parents and talk about differences for those families. And this is based on an interesting study. And I should note that, in the notes of these slides are links or references to all of these studies. This was very interesting because it centered on single parents at the start of the pandemic and through the pandemic period, and took into account the particular impact of dealing with school closures for single parents and the loss of childcare for single parents. So right away in April 2020, 1 in 4 single parents were unemployed, again, higher than average for all adults. And that it's important to note these unemployment rates recovered more slowly for single parents throughout 2021, perhaps in part due to their unequal exposure to these school and childcare closures. And related to that, and we'll be talking about this throughout, is that levels of worrying or anxiety among single parents continued to worsen throughout 2021, which I think is an important finding to think about. We know that, for children, young children and teens, having their parents worry, having anxiety in the household has impacts on their development, and they're not positive ones. So this led to the passage in 2021 of the American Rescue Plan. These factors led to this, happily, and the provisions of the expansion of the child tax credit under this are listed on this slide. I apologize for those of you who are really very familiar with this. I don't know, because I'm not there, how many of you may be parents yourselves and maybe experienced this for yourself. But beginning in July of 2021 and for the 6 months following that through the end of the year, parents of children from 0 to 6 received $300 a month, or $1,800 per young child per month, even including those parents who were earning no income at that time. And this was, as we'll see as I go into the history of the child tax credit a little more in later slides, this was really a big change. This was historic. This was almost a kind of, experiment on the part of policymakers. Parents of children who were slightly older, up to through 17, received $250 a month, or $1,500 per older child. This monthly provision of cash was something that really was groundbreaking, and I think wouldn't have come about except for those conditions created by the pandemic. And excuse me, in the tax season in early 2022, the parents who filed their taxes and claimed it would receive an additional lump sum, or did receive an additional lump sum amount of $1,800 per child or $1,500 per child, depending on the age of their children. And the important thing is there was no income requirement to receive this credit, so that parents who didn't earn enough and hadn't earned enough to receive the child tax credit in previous years at tax time experienced this kind of windfall for the first time. And it really had huge impacts. And there were many people really experiencing this kind of benefit for the first time. And there were other people able to study this impact on poverty. There was no income requirement, again, although there were caps on families with higher incomes, and there's more about this in the slides. It's important to note that what made this possible is that the CTC was fully refundable. Which means that parents could claim all of the credit even if they didn't owe any taxes, no matter what their income level. And this had, of course, many positive effects for these low-income children. A lot of this was seen in surveys that were conducted all around the country, nationally and locally. The monthly cash benefits were responsible in the end for moving more than 3 million children out of poverty across the country. And this happened very, very quickly. The next few points I'm making on this slide are important because it didn't really happen for a couple of years, but later analysis of transactional data. Okay, so this isn't just surveying parents and asking them about the impacts and what they spent this money on. This is analysis of transactional data from bank accounts and credit cards from several partner financial institutions during that time, right, of the expansion, showed that recipients of the CTC increased their spending on groceries, education, and childcare, spent more money reducing debt, and incurred fewer overdraft fees. And this is really crucial. This study shows that they were not significantly likely to leave the workforce because they had this extra cash in their pockets. In fact, some studies, and these are other studies separate from this one, found that the CTC actually supported work participation by paying for families' childcare. Again, the citations for those that important study is in the notes to these slides. And then I also just want to point up here quickly that the expansion made a bigger difference in some states than it did in others. And I have some examples on this slide. And I'll talk more about these positive effects, but we are going to talk more again later on about differences across different states because it's such an important part of the picture of child poverty and really systemic disadvantage in our country. For now, though, I want to talk briefly about the fact that the expansion did end. It was not renewed, and there were efforts to do so. Build Back Better legislation in late 2021 attempted to reduce child poverty by more than 40%. As part of this legislation, the CTC expansion was revised a little bit and refined to be even, I think, a little better. They expanded the maximum credit to $3,600 for children under age 6 and $3,000 for children age 6 to 17. And really, you know, again, they made it fully refundable. They were really on track for this. And I'm sorry, this slide, I'm obviously not a political scientist. This slide sort of puts all of the burden on Senator Joe Manchin's shoulders, and I'm sure it doesn't belong there. But this was an important theme at the time, and he was pretty vocal in talking about his reservations regarding the expansion or making the expansion more permanent. And his framing included concerns around inflation, work participation, you know, the question of whether or not, if you remember, you know, people were not perhaps joining up in the workforce in the way some would like them to at that time. And there were thoughts that that was encouraging inflation. And so, you know, there was this idea that perhaps it was the fault of the child tax credit and this easy money that parents were experiencing. And also, of course, there was this talk about the fear that parents would spend it on drugs. We'll come back to that kind of claim. And there were interesting claims that he made that grandparents who were caregivers for their children could not receive the child tax credit, which were not true. But in late summer 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed instead of Build Back Better. And what this meant was that this really precluded the continuation of the expansion. As part of that bill, we got a different format of the child tax credit. And I do want to highlight here that I think that there were some wonderful stories in the press around this time that really tried to kind of push back against some of the myths around the child tax credit, even though not all of the research that we have today had been conducted yet. And I wanted to highlight, as you know, there are many stories, but just this one piece that I really loved in the Washington Post from October, and that it highlighted, I thought, the value of the credit beautifully by focusing in on the words of actual caregivers and their lived experience in the way that researchers like to do when they can. And it included the story right up front of caregiver grandparents who were able to claim the credit, but were afraid of that they were going to lose it, as in fact they eventually did. And it also focused in on some other good stories about real working caregivers and, how hard it was at that time to make ends meet. So I wanted to highlight that for you. And I know that there are many others. So I'm going to take a brief, going to give you a brief history lesson now, and I hope it's not too dry, but I think it's important to look back and think about how the child tax credit started. And first and foremost, it's just really important to realize it was not constructed to serve as an anti-poverty policy originally. It was established in 1997, and that year is very important. It's the year after the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act ended welfare as we know it, quote unquote, by removing the entitlement for children and families to cash assistance through the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program. And that program, of course, was replaced by the Temporary Aid to Needy Families program, or TANF. And the federal government designed TANF to be administered by states, who could then define themselves in each state what a needy family looked like and set a standard of need for what those families needed, and then supply some cash receipt with work requirements very most often, and time limits. So the CTC, again, was not created as an anti-poverty measure. On the contrary, it's part of the US tax code. And under it, the people who needed the help the most did not receive the credit because they needed at this time to earn at least $10,000, and no part of it was refundable as any kind of refund to them. It was really just intended to offset any tax debts at tax time by middle-class families. And then this next slide provides you with a couple of an overview of a couple of developments over time in terms of how Congress changed this child tax credit. And just quickly, in 2001, it was changed so that it was partially refundable. But this is a very complicated provision. It basically meant that the refund was capped at 15% of the family's earned income above the requirement of $10,000. So this clearly benefited higher earning parents far more than lower earning parents. And it meant that you also needed to earn more and more with each child in order to obtain the full benefit. In 2009, they lowered the earnings requirement to $3,000, but it was still partially refundable. And this really could lead into a whole little discussion of universal versus targeted benefits, but I'm going to move on from this because I want to focus in on this last tax bill on the CTC in 2017, the last one before the pandemic. What's important about it is that the provisions on this slide very closely match the current provisions of the child tax credit. So after the expansion, we basically went back to this. There's one slight difference, but in essence, to qualify at this point, families had to earn at least $2,500. It's still only partially refundable, and the maximum credit was increased from $1,000 to $2,000 per child, which is helpful to some. And also, this was also extended upward to benefit more higher earning middle-class families. So it really is still not an anti-poverty provision. It does benefit some lower income families, but it benefits them in many cases far less than middle class families. And it's very important to note, I guess the $1,400 has been extended since to $1,600, but this is really basically what we have today. Now we can talk a little bit about, under these provisions, which children were and now again are left out of the child tax credit, because that's very important. So before 2021, roughly 1 in 3 children were ineligible for the full CTC refund because of this link to family income. 11% were completely ineligible, 11% of children, and 22 were eligible for only a portion of the full credit. So in total, that's 33%, or 1 in 3 children were ineligible for the full credit. This next point is really important to think about for a second. 2 adults working full-time at the federal minimum wage will only take home $25,375 in earnings, and therefore would not qualify for that full refund. And then we have a couple of other bullets explaining how this worked. I want to say that this slide and the next view, I just need to take a moment to say that this is not based on my own work. I owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University. I'm grateful to them for their work. They've put out so many briefs, been widely cited in the media, and I'm grateful to them more generally because I completed my PhD in the program that houses them in 2019, and I learned so much from them. So I just need to say that this slide and the next view really will reflect some work that they've done looking back at data from 2019 and 2020 in terms of what children were left out and are left out today. So again, these data reflect their analysis from 2019 and 2020, but I believe that they really also reflect what's going on today. So this first one is on racial inequity, and it is about which children are ineligible for child tax credits or eligible for only a partial credit. The red bars on the left of each grouping reflect those who are really just completely ineligible. So on the very leftmost here, these 2 bars here for all families, really should say all children, are repeated on each of the next couple of slides. It's there as a reference point. So that's the 33% in total of children who are ineligible. And then you have a breakdown here of 3 groups by race or ethnicity. And you note the very high percentage of Black children who are ineligible here, completely ineligible, 18%. That's almost 1 in 5. And the blue bars, of course, reflect that, those who are not fully eligible. And so if we add that up, that means that 50%, of Black children are not eligible for the full credit. And then we see also here that, the rates for Latino and white families. This next slide is really looking at children in certain types of family by the structure of the family. And what I find shocking on this slide is the very high rates of children in single parent families led by parents who identify as female. We're looking at a 64% total of children living in those families who do not see the full child tax credit. And then finally, this slide looks at the age of children and the number of children. So families with very young children generally do make less money. And so, this is a pretty high rate here for 37% total of children, higher than the average for all families. Children living in these families, are less likely to be eligible for the full credit. And then again, we have the single parent, sorry, not the single parent, the families with 3 or more children. You note the children with 3 or more children living in families with 3 or more children, only about 2/3 of them are really eligible for the full credit, which is it's really interesting. Briefly here, just want to show us another slide that really talks about where in the country these children are most likely to live. So if you're ineligible, I don't know if you can read the smaller numbers here. The dark blue states reflect areas of the country where 40 to 49% of the children living in those states are going to be not eligible for the full CTC. So there isn't the breakdown here between those who are ineligible completely and those who are ineligible for the full CTC, but it's still, I think, very important to think about and to know. And then again, there's a link to this in the notes to this slide, and we are going to be looking more at the situation with states. This is just a brief commercial interview to talk about a book that I love, that I've found really helpful. I'm currently looking at the social safety net and the differences across states, and I'm using this work to hopefully to support advocates in different states in changing some of the policies that are local in their areas. And this book has been really helpful to me in learning more about kind of the history and the level of disadvantage, as these authors like to term it, in certain areas. And I think that it's relevant given, what we saw here, and then, the areas that the book tends to really illuminate. Getting back here to focus on this child tax credits, things did go back to normal, and the regulations meant that families could again claim $2,000 per child per year under the former policy that we looked at that was scoped out in 2017 by Congress. Only families earning more than $2,500 could claim the credit. And, as a result, basically roughly 1 in 3 children is again ineligible for the CTC because their families have low or moderate incomes. And predictably, as you know, probably almost certainly, there was a significant increase in child poverty in 2022, going up from 5.2% in late 2021 up to 12.4% a year later. This happened, in stages. Obviously, families did get that lump sum payment at tax time. Many of them did, not all of them did. And that was helpful, but still by the end of the year, we were seeing increases, however you measure poverty. And I promised myself today I wouldn't get lost in talking about different poverty measures, but measures of material hardship, measures of everything, increased over the course of the year. And as soon as this information, became public in September or late summer of 2023, I have to give so much of, so many journalists gold stars for how they handled this and how much publication there was around this. This is kind of my favorite headline because it describes so well what we did. And I give them, many people a gold star. This was an interview with the director of Columbia's Center on Poverty and Social Policy, Chris Weimer, who was interviewed and really explains well, if you haven't read it, the terms that I've tried to highlight here, like fully refundable versus non-refundable. It does a great job. And I think it was Chris, maybe not in this piece, but Chris described the expansion as a kind of 3 social policy experiments in one. So there was the expanded monthly provision, right? Those monthly payments that were sent out to families at a critical time. And then there was the lump sum payment for families who'd never experienced that before. And then the stop, the cessation, when the families lost this support. So there were some, again, just terrific work, and I've chosen one story among many to highlight as one of my favorites. And I'm just going to turn off my my microphone for a second and take a sip of water because my voice is struggling, and I'll let you read this slide to yourselves. But this was an interview of a pediatrician specifically focusing in on what happens, what they were seeing in the wake of the expiration, basically, of the expansion of the child tax credit. But I do really recommend this story, although, it is gripping, and it's important to really look. And I think journalism, as I said, did a great job of this, of really looking at the experiences of specific families in this time. because it's, a lot of the focus on the research is very quantitative, it's very dry. We talk about differences in poverty levels and change over time. But when you really see the impacts and you hear parents talking about the impacts, and in this case, providers of medical care talking about these kinds of differences, I think most people agree we shouldn't have poverty like this in our country or our world. So again, a gold star to many, many journalists out there. So I wanted to take a little time. Before I worked at NCCP, I worked for a year at a New York City settlement house on the Lower East Side, a community-based organization. And we were able to conduct a two-wave mixed method study of about 1,000 parents who were either program participants or staff members who were also parents at these New York City settlement houses. And I came on board during the first wave, was able to complete that wave, and then I was the primary investigator on the second wave. And we were able to kind of ask questions over this divide when people had the monthly payments. And then we started again in late 22 when they had lost the payments, had possibly experienced the lump sum payments, but didn't have that money anymore in most cases. And we asked parents about their material hardship, their food security, a lot of good questions about how they received this, whether they received the CTC and how they used it. With about 50 participants in each wave, we were able to conduct hour-long interviews. And those, I think, were the most illuminating for me. We were able to talk to them in their native languages. Just to briefly talk to you again about the kinds of parents who were in this sample. More than half were immigrant parents, although they had to have at least one child born in the US because we wanted to be sure that they were eligible for the child tax credit, and that was the child at least had to be born in the US. Almost half reported very low levels of income. Some people weren't able to estimate their annual income, and that's usually a sign that they are very low income. About a quarter had not completed high school. About 2 in 5 participated in the study in another language. And most of them, we were divided, but in this reflects the second wave. Most of them had children under 6 years old, and about 1 in 4 included at least one family member with a disability. So the findings, as you can imagine, reflected a great deal of, material hardship, food and housing insecurity. I will say briefly here that, there was an earlier slide that talked about how the child tax credit was more effective in some states than in others. And some respondents, while very grateful for the benefit and, had lots of good things to say about the child tax credit, that many of them or some of them said, this really wasn't enough money to deal with our costs in New York City. So, that is a factor. But really, they were at this point really dealing with those high costs and the inflation that people were experiencing here and in other parts of the country. I want to focus in for a second on the last bullet, which is that we had an unusually high percentage of parents screening positive for at least moderate anxiety and/or depression. And this outcome, I must say, was predicted by the number of material hardships they reported and their debt. There was a very clear relationship, and it was especially high for parents of young children. And as I think at least one of your sessions has or will cover, that kind of parental stress is very detrimental to children and their development. So again, it was the qualitative interviews that showed us a lot. Everyone talked about the cost of food, and we were able to talk about with them what the loss of the CTC benefit meant to them. And this one mother said, it would be really big help to have to our family if we could have that money every month again. But there's no money, so you have to save on groceries. We don't have much, so we have to eat only a couple of things and usually just steam or boil them. This is partly due to the desire to save on gas costs. So I thought it was always very interesting to hear about the sort of multiple hardships that people were dealing with and the sort of aggregate impact of those on them. So here we have food and we have utilities, This next mother actually lost her home during the pandemic after she lost her job. And she said, it's not like, no matter how hard you work or how much you make, you can never catch up. I literally work 4 jobs to feed my kids. I'm a delivery person, I'm a security guard, I'm a part-time cook, and I'm schedule coordinator for a moving company just to be able to manage. So these people were so generous in their experiences, in sharing their experiences with us. Um, and, this woman was living without really having a home of her own. She was doubled up with her children, with relatives. She said that whenever she would try to get another apartment for herself, she didn't make enough money to even get a call back from landlords currently in the city. So again, it's these multiple hardships that were really taking a toll. And then we had a, heavy use of food pantries. It was quite striking. This one mother said, it's not embarrassing. It's more embarrassing that they could catch me stealing than to go to a pantry. But if I go to a pantry twice, they don't give me anything. They tell me no. They tell me you have to wait until it's your turn again. So, this mother was really scheduling her weeks between taking care of teens with disabilities and, working for cash jobs. She was also just scheduling her weeks so that she could hit different food pantries. And I believe that, even families who were able to receive SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP was no longer supplemental for them. They were supplementing SNAP by going to food pantries. So these stories were really impactful, and I just share them with you because I think it's really important to talk about that. Now we want to talk a little bit about state level CTCs, because when Build Back Better didn't pass, a lot of states, a lot of different places in the country said, well, we're going to do a state level CTC just for the people in our state. Many of them had already begun that. They either made the provisions more generous in many states, or they started a new CTC in their state. And these are just a couple of passages, really, or passage. Yeah, it's analysis offered by another paper from that was co-authored by the center and also by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. And it's really just projecting that if in almost all states, a refundable state child tax credit of $2,000 or more could reduce the child poverty rate by about a quarter. And then they could also, if they wanted to be really generous, cut child poverty rates by half. So again, citation for that is in the notes to this slide. If this is really interesting for you, I urge you to look at it more closely, because it's valuable to think about. And we're now going to talk a little bit more about those state level CTCs. I obviously think that the details of these policies matter a lot. So we're going to dwell on that for a few minutes. It's a little dry, but I think it is important. So we now have 14 states who provide permanent child tax credits. Hooray. And 11 of them are fully refundable, listed here on this first bullet point. And there are 3 states that are offering non-refundable credits: Idaho, Oklahoma, and Utah. And 3 of the states mentioned above created their new CTC programs in the last year, in 2023. Minnesota, Oregon, and Utah. And 7 of the states mentioned above expanded their existing credits. So what we'll also now talk about are the provisions that really matter. I think you have a good feeling for that by now, but I want to talk about them just to be sure, and then we're going to look closely at the 3 new programs just to see what those are doing and what they're not doing. These provisions are the ones that are really thought to be the most important. The fully refundable, obviously, and I've given a sort of brief explainer on it in the right-hand column. Being available without minimum income requirement, right? Which means that families with low income or no income are eligible to receive the credit, the tax refund. And this requires full refundability. You can't have one without the other, although I believe you can have a fully refundable credit that does have a minimum income requirement, and we'll have a little story about that coming up here. Another option is the size of the credit, and more generous credits are going to be more effective, obviously. And then the maximum credit amount per child rather than per household. We did have in the past had some states say, well, we'll give this much to a family, but obviously giving more to larger families is more equitable for those larger families. And then the question of these advance payments or these monthly increments, those are very helpful in meeting basic needs and alleviating family stress. All of the studies find, but it's still pretty rare, as we'll see. There are a couple of additional options that didn't make it onto this slide. One is to schedule recurring increases through legislation to these tax credit amounts. So tying them to inflation is something that is recommended. And or, setting a maximum income. It's a very interesting question. When does this phase out? What families make too much to be eligible? And so setting that maximum at a lower level, as we'll see, provides the credit to fewer middle-class families, and this can support greater generosity to low-income households. So this again gets into the universal versus targeted question. We have some legislative provisions here for the Minnesota's new child tax credit. I have inserted in the notes here on this slide a link to the actual legislation, which you're welcome to read, and you can correct me, but this is how I read the statute. And I also want to note that there has been Columbia Center did a little bit of analysis on this when it was under debate, and they estimated that almost 300,000 households in Minnesota are projected to benefit from this new policy, and that the projected reduction to poverty would be up to 33%. So this is a very exciting child tax credit program, brand new. They're even working on providing monthly installments to this. But note the size of the credit. I think it's the largest, if I'm not mistaken, of any state child tax credit. And there are no minimum income requirements, and it's fully refundable. And a key point is that the phase out happens at a fairly low level for married filing jointly families. It's $35,000, and it doesn't mean that you don't get any credit, but it starts to phase out. So it's really targeting the lower income families. Next, we'll take a brief look at Oregon's brand new child tax credit, fully refundable, again, phasing out at a fairly low income. The size of the credit is $1,000 per child, which is fairly generous. There are states that are just offering a few $100s per child. And this is available, going back up to Minnesota, they're making this available for each and every dependent in the child with no cap on the number of children, okay, up to the age of 18. Oregon is making it available, so they're doing some targeting here because we know that families with younger children struggle more. This is only available for the children who are from 0 to 5 years of age for up to 5 dependent children. And there is some analysis. I myself have a teen, and I feel that they're expensive, but I'm not low income. And there's some real analysis underway that suggests that maybe we really do get a lot more bang for our buck from these in terms of poverty reduction if we focus more on younger children. So there are no advance payments with this program. You would get the full amount of whatever you qualify for at tax time. And then finally, this is a nice counterpoint for us. This is Utah's new child tax credit program. It is not fully refundable. So there is an income requirement here, and they must earn an income. I don't have here the exact amount of what they must earn, but they have to get they have to have a tax burden, and none of this is going to be useful to people at the very lowest levels. And the size of the credit is $1,000 per child. And it is available for every dependent child in the family who is from 1 to 3 years of age. So only very young families with very young children. There was some analysis I found on this from the Institute for Tax. And this is really striking that they project that only 1.4% of households in Utah will actually benefit from this. They think that among those eligible, the average tax savings will be around $400, and only 4.3% of children in Utah will benefit from this, and that no family will actually earn that entire $1,000 the way that this is structured. So the details obviously really do matter. And with that, I guess I will move into, this lovely invitation that Rachel gave me to think a little bit about the stories we might need to move forward with this very promising kind of program or policy. Obviously, we've gone over the details that matter particularly. And I would always be on hand to help anybody read the legislation and try to figure out what this is going to do and what it's not going to do, and we can reach out to other experts for more analysis. Um, and I think that, it's also important to try to figure out how many low-income parents and children are actually going to benefit from this. Is this really aiming more at the middle class, or is this, targeting a broader, more universal spectrum, or is it really targeting the low-income parents? As an example of this kind of story that includes an important policy option, it's not a complete success, but there was a CTC that actually failed to be, it failed in Montana last year. So the headline here, which is from the Montana Free Press, and I apologize that I didn't get a byline on this, but you can obtain one because there's a link in the notes to this. This says Democratic opposition may stymie the governor's child tax credit push. It did stymie it. But what I noted in reading this story is that the article quoted one Democrat mentioning that an income was required for families. So this was, I think, fully refundable is the way I read the legislation, which is again quoted in the notes here in the link. But it did require that families earned an income. And that this provision was a stumbling block for this more progressive legislator who wanted to see a child tax credit really address the poorest families. And I have, my idea, I guess, is kind of based on my ideas as a researcher, where we like to compare people who are very close to each other, but are going through some sort of policy difference or, intervention or experiment. So I think it would be interesting right now. We've looked at the Minnesota state tax credit, and we see how game-changing that could be for the poorest families. So I would want to talk to families living in poverty, under the poverty level, who are in Minnesota around tax time. At the same time, comparing very similar families in South Dakota or North Dakota, where they have no state level CTC. Because when families living in states with these generous CTC programs get a lump sum refund, even if they have, no income or very little income, it can be a really important time for them. I saw this in my qualitative work on the SHARP study, and this contrast could be really promoted with great effect. It will tell so much of the story around the CTC that needs to be told, and how these programs can make such a great difference. And Arizona and California could be another sort of comparison. And again, there's a new bill now in Congress, and I didn't focus on it here because so many people think it will not pass, but I do think it's important to focus on. And they want to bring the provisions from the expansion into the existing federal CTC. It could be really valuable to hear from parents about this, because so many of them did experience the expansion and say, how would you spend it? What would you spend it on today? What would you do with it? And then, I do think I know you can't always do everything you'd like to do, but I would really like to follow up with legislators, especially those who voted against BBB, Build Back Better, and say, we know now, in 2024, what families really did with this money and what it really meant for children in our country. Could you review your position on this policy? You might not like what you hear, but I think it's important to ask people. I know they have really smart staffers, and I'm willing to think that some of them made mistakes, for instance, around, whether or not grandparents could claim the provision. So I thought some more about this as I was working on these state level differences in the safety net. And This graph here has nothing to do with child tax credits. It's really more about the provision of cash supports to low-income families over time in this country, because I think it is really important to kind of look at, where we've been, and to think more broadly about why the expansion, hasn't yet survived on the federal level. And so was an important development, right? I said earlier, 1996 was an important year. This shows that we peaked in terms of how many families we actually provided cash to it in 1994. And this was, of course, under the Aid to Families with Dependent Children. And then, it's dwindled down through the period on this graph. This is from a document on TANF from the Department of Health and Human Services. And, I just generally think that, we've got to continue to work to shift the public perception of low-income parents, full stop. And as a caveat to thinking about the power and potential of the child tax credit, I just want to point out 27 states have no state level child tax credit yet. And of those, 9 of them have no state income tax. So it's really hard to envision them, right? Creating a state level child tax credit as powerful as the one in Minnesota can be. And I think that, it's important to think more broadly about different policies that could help us with the problem of child poverty. And I'm not, some people say, well, we should just get rid of TANF at this point, and just try to do things with the child tax credit. I'm not sure that I believe in that. As I've said, I'm not a political scientist, but I am really wary as I do my work with state advocates. There are some of them who say, we can't even talk to our legislators right now about a child tax credit because they associate it so strongly with parents who, were exploiting the expansion and were not spending that money, and who wouldn't go back to work because of the expansion of the child tax credit. So we definitely, I think, are looking in some of our more progressive states, at a patchwork of policies, including guaranteed income pilots. But I'm not sure that we want a simple plan or a complicated plan. I just think that we have seen that a child tax credit can be altered to be more inclusive and more supportive of low-income families. And then we've seen it be altered again to be less inclusive. So I would really advocate for any story that emphasizes the dignity of low-income parents, because I think it's still an attitudinal shift that we all want to work on. And I'm really interested in any story that asks the questions on this slide in connection with any policy or even on its own. The first question, about how easy it is, or, what is it like for a parent to access the social safety net in their state? The states right now are given so much control over that and over the generosity of those safety nets, which may not be a bad thing entirely, but we need more light shining on that and how different it is in different states for children growing up. I really like to hear from parents about how much debt they're carrying today, because we saw such a big increase in debt among low-income parents after the pandemic, and a lot of questions remain around that. Do they have an emergency fund right now? And we know that debt predicts anxiety and even depression in parents, and how bad that is. The third question, is the family able to maintain a checking or savings account? Banks charge fees that reinforce structural inequities, as many have noted, and this condition and payday lending can really add to family challenges. So I'm very interested in stories about that. We know, with question number 4, how much money do they have left at the end of the month? What bills are going unpaid? The material hardships, the cumulative material hardships really predict anxiety in parents and, add to developmental challenges for parents. And, around food insecurity and security for families who are not extremely food insecure, I would always request, a lot of questions are asked, because I think it's really hard for parents to open up about that topic. And it's really good to find out what strategies they're using and to really, ask qualitative questions and get the full picture on what parents are doing around food, leaning back on that pediatrician story. So I'm going to wrap up now. Thank you all so much. And that's my email address. I hope to hear from some of you. And again, I'm so grateful for this opportunity.
Time to stick around for a couple of questions if there are any. Let's see, do any of the journalists have? Lois, let's start with Lois.
So I don't know if this is good news or bad news. I'm from Utah, and I have never heard an explanation of why it was 1 to 3 instead of 0 to 3. Do you know?
I noted that I thought about that too, and I noted that it's a cutoff for the birthday of the child at the end of that tax year, but it is still very strange. So if you've had a child and they haven't turned 1 by the end of that year, you don't qualify for the credit, and I do find that extremely strange. And I would also want to ask questions around that. Great idea for a story.
Any other questions?
Stephen Basahan with the Gulf States Newsroom. You talked about how there was like this triple experiment, but really we had the lump sum side of the tax credit, and then we had the monthly payments. And it seems like the states are moving in the lump sum once a year direction. Is that what your research has shown, that tends to be more effective? I know Give Directly has done some research on that suggests the lump sum side.
It's really interesting. States, I think we noted that Minnesota is going to work towards monthly provision. What I read about that is that they need to sort of recalibrate their administrative systems in order to make that a reality. So it's not that they don't want to do it, but they can't yet do it. And I don't know what other states are strongly considering it, but the research shows, and there is some great stuff on this on Columbia's website, the research shows that the monthly provision is uniquely helpful to the very low income, who, as I indicated, sometimes they can't even tell you how much money they're making in a year or even a month. They're just struggling so hard. So to get that influx, every month, it has unique benefits. And I think that Columbia did a paper, as I recall, stating that lump sum payments were used differently by families. They were used, I believe, in paying rent arrears. We saw a lot of that here in New York City. A lot of families got into arrears with their rent, so they used them for larger ticket items like that. Whereas the monthly payments, and of course this was still during a very difficult period in the fairly early in the post-pandemic period when we had those monthly payments. They were used largely, I believe, in my study, it was all on food, clothing, food and clothing, and I think utilities was the third item, fairly, smaller needs. And so I think there's a good case to be made for both, or for splitting the difference possibly. Thanks for that question.
Any other questions, comments? If not, I'm going to end by sharing something with you, Karen, that I think brilliantly highlights your closing remarks of your presentation, and that is our speaker, Bianca Vasquez-Tonez of the Associated Press. She has helped produce an incredible series on chronic school absenteeism. I really don't need to be on the screen. Which camera should I look in so that I, here? Okay. So she did this incredible story on school absenteeism. Mm-hmm. And she spoke to parents around the country about the reasons that their kids are not in school. Mm-hmm. And most of them were connected to insecure housing and instability. And one of the journalists asked her, how do you talk to families? How do you develop a strategy on how to get people to open up to you about this very sensitive, very stressful, painful subject? And she and I talked, and I said, what I've learned through the years is that sometimes if you do it right and you're empathetic, people will trust you with this information and they will feel comfortable. But she talked about one woman who, when she asked her that question, she just burst into tears. She just absolutely lost it, and you could tell that it's probably shameful to her, it's frustrating to her. She probably has 4 or 5 buses to get on every day and things to worry about. So I would ask you to just send us to our hotel rooms tonight with one more exhortation about the need to do stories like this, to give voice to those people.
Yes,
To give,
1,000 times yes. Thank you, Rachel.
I guess I answered it for you.
Yeah, no, I think
No, I
that's
mean, again,
beautiful.
and one other thing is that what I've learned in now 30 years of covering social policy affecting children and families is the demonization of poor people that began during the welfare reform, well, historically, but certainly was amplified during the welfare reform debate, makes these kinds of programs even more difficult to get across because it's seen as giving money to people who are undeserving, who are immoral, and who whatever. So
Yeah, I will add one more point, Rachel, here. It's just one of my favorite discoveries from the work I did on the SHARP study. And I think when we finished the quantitative part of the study first, and when I shared the finding that when asked about, how much food do you have in your household? Well, there were 4 answers. I have enough, we have enough, but not the types we like. Sometimes we don't have enough, and we often don't have enough were the 4 possible responses. Well, 40% chose the second response. We have enough, but not enough of the type of food that we like. And I sensed that was a really interesting finding that maybe didn't explain everything. And I had some people, counter this when I showed them these quantitative findings. They said, well, that doesn't seem very bad. I mean, it makes it seem like people are not really struggling, because I don't get to eat at my favorite restaurant every night or anything like that. And that, of course, that's not really what it is. And so when we did the study, when we did the interviews, we had heard some very different things. So families who had responded in that way on the survey would, when opening up to one of our interviewers, really provide important details. Perhaps their children were eating, but they weren't eating. Perhaps they were only eating, really cheap fast food because that's the only way their budgets would stretch. And, I'll never forget the person who said, it's just like in our home country, which I won't name, we just some nights don't have enough food and we just sit there. And these were all people who had answered that question in that way. And that's where I think it is really hard. It's hard for parents.
on that note, I would like to take this opportunity, Karen, to thank you so much for taking time out to join us and to educate us about the promise and potential of the child tax credit. Let's all show Karen our appreciation.